we had a busy morning this morning. We had a couple of coaching clients online, generally both working on our computers, um, and we had this podcast recording scheduled to do. And to be honest, I was feeling a little bit low energy, a little bit fatigued mentally after spending quite a few hours on the computer. So we had a little break. What did you do, Mike, to recharge for half hour, 45 minutes?
I went out, got some daylight. I mean, it's a bit cloudy today, but went out for a half-hour walk. And part of that walk, there was a little uphill bit through the underpass, and I did three sort of progressive sprints. Not those started off sort of 50-60%, only about 30 meters. Just did that, trying to keep practice my hyper arch fascia mechanisms, the fascial stuff. Trying to work on that. Yeah, nothing too strenuous, but daylight and a bit of vigorous exercise. Very short, vigorous exercise.
Nice, nice. Yeah, very similar. I felt like I needed to get outside, but also needed something to eat. And
Mm,
we only had half an hour, 45 minutes. So I did 5 minutes of animal flow, so crawling around on the floor,
cool.
like various different animals. Finished with some explosive push-ups, again, just to do something a bit more dynamic and invigorating. Just 4 sets of 5 reps. So could do more, but a number that is enough to feel like you've woken yourself up, but without really fatiguing yourself.
Yeah,
And I did that with the door open, back door open, to get some light and air in. I didn't do it outside because the ground was cold and wet.
yeah.
And then I had a very quick lunch, sitting with the door open, looking out at the grey February sky where I think the sun should be.
It's
It's
there
up there
somewhere.
somewhere. I was
It's there
facing it, I
somewhere.
think. And yeah, just had a couple of lamb ribs and a glass of coconut kefir, which is my new thing.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, not a big lunch, but yeah, feel re-energized. Um,
It's funny because I was listening to a podcast with Pavel Tsatsouline and Andrew Huberman. 4 hours. I'm only part of the way through it, but they were talking about the grease, the groove, and where you do little bits of high intensity, but only like 50% of your capacity. So it might be your maximum intensity, like sprinting, but only for as long as 50% of how long you could keep that speed up. And he was saying Russian research shows that if you did that every, from 10 minutes upwards to half an hour plus throughout the day, how that actually has a positive impact on the brain and your actual intellectual and academic performance. And I think the Russians were very, very into using their athletes and their performances as national propaganda. And so they did everything they could to find out how to maximize human performance. I think that was interesting coming from there.
yeah, as you know, I'm a big fan of Pavel as well, and the explosive
Yeah.
push-ups that I was doing were based on his Q&D formula, quick and dead formula. So
Yes.
an overview of that is to do very similar to what you said, submaximal sets, short bursts. His protocol is to do kettlebell swings and explosive push-ups. I usually just do squat jumps and push-ups. I do it slightly differently. I did the squat jumps yesterday. I'll do push-ups today,
Yeah.
and then I'll alternate like that. But yeah, it takes minutes, and while there is a strength benefit to it, the focus of this particular protocol is actually on mitochondrial efficiency and
Mm.
density. So the idea is that you're trying to stimulate the batteries of the cells to become more efficient. So it's thinking beyond just making your muscles bigger and stronger. Hopefully that happens too. But it's actually thinking about how can you make the cells more efficient, which should be beneficial from a longevity point of view.
Yeah, so for a couple of friends of mine have mentioned that we might be a little bit too technical sometimes. So I just want to address maybe what mitochondria are. I think we think of it just as a normal term that everybody should know because of our study into it. And you mentioned cells. So mitochondria are essentially the power cells in every cell of our body. They're what produce our energy, that enables us to move, to keep warm, that powers every function in our body. So if you imagine millions of power plants throughout our body, and do those power plants work well? How many have we got, and do they work well? How much power can they produce? And so from what it sounds like, your protocol there is aimed at improving the efficiency of the power, so you get more power out for the same amount of fuel in, and potentially also improving how much power they output overall. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's my understanding of it from his book Q&D, and yeah, I think that sums it up nicely. What I love about his work is it's very, very simple protocols.
Yeah,
The books are written in a way that makes you want to have a go at it straight away. And there's a little dry humor in there as well. I think
yeah,
he's great overall.
yeah. Yeah, for anyone interested in his stuff, he's not the norm sort of bodybuilding gym type person. He's quite hard nosed, and I think his comments about sort of commercial fitness are maybe a bit harsh at times, but he doesn't pull his punches. And I've found his work, his ideas make so much sense and effective. But also you can play around with it as well. Going back to what you were saying about the mitochondria, the powerhouses, and this may filter in a little bit to what we're going to talk about later on. But research seems to be suggesting that across the board, degenerative disease, from cancer to Alzheimer's to diabetes to autoimmune conditions, all have as part of their symptomology defective mitochondria. There seems to be some inhibition of the ability to create energy within the cells. And I think that's a key thing to remember, is like actually a pure first principles level. It's how well can we produce energy within the body that seems to allow us either to protect ourselves from illness and disease, and also enable us to perform well, or the flip side, not. If we're not producing enough energy, our body has to make choices about what can and can't be done. And it means certain things may not get done for a long time, which ends up in illness and disease. That's sort of how I sort of understand the role of mitochondria and these energy production units.
Great. Well, I think, yeah, let's get into the theme for today, which is Ozempic and other fat jabs, which in the media loads at the moment. I know, Mike, you never miss a copy of the Daily Mail.
Yeah, I go out and my excuse is I go and buy it for mum and dad. It's not my favourite newspaper by any means. I think there's a lot of emotional rhetoric. I don't consider myself right or left wing, but it's predominantly right wing emotional rhetoric. But I do find some really interesting articles on the health side of things in there. And interestingly, a lot coming in a lot closer. It used to be like a 10-year gap between stuff I'd followed on the internet and it coming into the newspapers. Now that gap seems to have shrunk quite a bit, which I find very encouraging. So now I think we can start having discussions where we're talking about stuff and the general public are getting to see this stuff. So yeah, fat jabs. What were your first thoughts? Apologies for fat. I don't think fat is a negative word. It's a purely descriptive word for me for, part of our body's makeup, and also part of the energy we take in terms of macronutrients, the three main groups: fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. So I don't mean to be offensive when I call them fat jabs, but what were your first thoughts on when you heard all of this, and that the NHS may be prescribing fat jabs in the obesity epidemic?
My first thoughts, so a bit of a reaction, really, which, so I'll be honest, I hadn't thought it through. Particularly, my first thoughts were Band-Aid solution, not getting to the root of the problem. So I've dialed that back a little bit because I think they could have a role for some people, and I don't want to be judgmental for people who are struggling, and this could be a useful tool for them. Overall, though, I think there's a bigger picture we've got to think about of why the obesity and overweight numbers are just increasing everywhere in the Western world. What's the root cause? So yeah, I think they're probably a valid tool. Safety aspects we don't really know yet. I've heard some negative stories in the media, celebrities who've tried it for a little while and had some rebound effects, I think. So yeah, those were my first impressions. What about yourself?
Yeah, I guess same thing. I have a natural inbuilt bias, probably developed from my mum and my grandmother, not to use medication, and that we should be able to sort everything out through diet and exercise and lifestyle and stuff. However, I have struggled for years with eating foods that aren't necessarily best for me. My weight has gone up and down. I think I've finally found a formula for myself, which interestingly we'll talk about. I think we'll get into a little bit of detail. Pretty much is a natural way of doing what Ozempic and Wegovy, Mounjaro, etc. do. But we can talk about that in a little bit. But what I do know when I look at, I think it's understanding of obesity. You know, we've had this view that it's people are lazy, greedy, this, that, and the other. But I tend to think of it more of an addiction. And when I say that, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so I'm not going to officially diagnose when people are addicted or anything. But when we knowingly do stuff over and over and over, which we know harms us in the long term, but we can't seem to stop ourselves from doing that behavior, for me, that is, the basis of an addiction. And sometimes it's based on actually taking in a substance. Obviously cigarettes and stronger drugs, heroin, stuff like that are the classic example when we talk about addicts. Alcohol is another one. There are differences in that, maybe taking heroin isn't socially acceptable, but alcohol is. And so people don't really want to talk about it as an addiction. But I think the most socially acceptable addiction we have is food. And this has been exacerbated by the food companies, the big multinationals that have teams of nutritionists and psychologists and physiologists who basically operate for the business. And that business, the jungle is that each business needs to earn more money. This is the world we operate in. Doesn't matter which industry. For food business, that means we need to get more people eating and buying our products, and we need to get those people buying more from us. This is essential rules for every business. And I think, unfortunately, they've got so good at it that the majority of people are really struggling. And we see this over the decades. These ultra-processed foods have come in more and more, and obesity rates are going up and up and up, despite increasing knowledge of what foods we should eat and exercise and stuff like that. So I don't think it's the fault of people per se. I think there's a time where we need to look and take decisive action, and sometimes we just unwittingly follow the public health advice, what we believe is good advice, and it's not always right. And I think we're seeing that now. So that's a long way of saying I think the fat jabs, for me, again, like you, I thought, oh, this is bad. But it's a bit like nicotine patches. Is it a way to stop you, to start that journey of stopping eating the junk food? And I think with some of the articles, some of the anecdotal stuff I've read, I believe that is potentially the case. because I was worried that you could still just carry on eating the rubbish food, and that's what people would do. But I've read a couple of articles now that have suggested that people have lost their cravings for junk food whilst on the fat jabs, and so actually they're eating decent food. They're not wanting alcohol and stuff like that anymore. And there's maybe an emotional cost to that because of your previous life's enjoyment tied to those things. But I think on the whole, as a starting point for some people, I think they have their place. However, like yourself, I think we need to be looking at the root cause, and educating. If you are going to do the fat jabs, there's a significant cost to this, to the NHS or to you individually. You're talking £200 plus a month to be able to fund this privately. And now you're not going to be able to fund it privately once you go below a certain BMI, or you need to be able to provide evidence of your height and your weight and stuff like that. So it's not straightforward, but I think, it has a role to play. But if we understand how it works, can we actually mimic that? And in fact, what is it mimicking? It's mimicking natural processes in life.
Yeah, okay. One of the first things you said was the idea that being overweight or obese comes from laziness or lack of willpower. So I've never really liked that analysis. It might be true in some cases, but I've worked with people who have a substantial amount of weight to lose, and all of them had tried many things, but the things that they were doing weren't working for them. There's reasons why that might be. It might be that they're trying something that's not really sustainable in the long term. So I think there's a huge information problem, firstly. I think there's also a let's just call it a momentum problem. So let's just say you've grown up in a household and environment where eating a certain way is the norm, and you've grown up carrying a lot of extra weight. It's going to be very difficult for you to break these patterns psychologically, emotionally, and physically. Your body will be used to a certain way of fueling itself, and breaking away from that requires a lot of effort. And to say that it's just a matter of willpower, I think diminishes what's going on here. So typically we're just told, all you need to do is reduce calories, just reduce the amount of energy that's coming in. If let's just give an example here. If somebody invited you for a big meal, say somebody invited you around for lunch on Sunday, and you know this person puts on a mean barbecue and supplies lots of food, what would you do beforehand to perhaps increase your appetite? So I'm guessing you'd probably eat less, maybe do some exercise, go for a walk or something beforehand. So you arrive at the barbecue with a good appetite. So what we've said there is eat less, move more, increases your appetite. That's the exact advice that we're giving to people to tell them to lose weight. So we're telling them to do two things, which are going to make them want to eat more. So I think that here we can touch on a little the mechanism of these jabs, and what they're actually doing is suppressing appetite, is my understanding.
Yeah, so for me, what they're doing, they're firing up, and the one that springs to mind is the GLP-1 agonist or receptor. I don't know the technical term, but it's a hormone that suppresses appetite. And in one of our previous podcasts, we talked about 3 specific hormones that suppress appetite. Now, in the natural way that this has happened through evolution, it's based on certain nutrients coming into the body, which means you get the right nutrients that the body needs. Once you've got enough of those, okay, you no longer need to be hungry. Okay, note that it said nutrients there and not energy. So it's not about how many calories came in, it's about certain nutrients, and the key ones that are shown to be satiating are proteins or amino acids, which are the building blocks of what we call protein. So they're the constituent parts. And key amino acids, I think leucine is one of them. They are key in turning on these hormones that tell us we don't need any more food. Interestingly, Pringles, their slogan used to be, once you pop, you just can't stop. Since Chris Van Tullochen has written his book and explained the mechanism and about how they are actually engineered to be addictive, they no longer use that terminology, that slogan. They've changed their advertising. They're not advertising being addictive anymore. But their mechanism was to take compounds from cooked meat that create the smell, that nice savory smell. Not the actual amino acids, though. These are the byproducts of cooking when we sort of caramelize meat and heat it, and you get that deep, rich flavor. Paste that onto some form of starchy material, and the body senses the meat compound and thinks, "Oh, great, these amino acids are coming in," but they're not there because it's starch, which isn't protein, and so your body keeps like, it must be here somewhere. You keep going because you've got this promise of these amino acids coming in, but they're not there. And this is one of the ways that food companies and indeed good chefs can override appetite to make you eat more and take more calories. Chinese cooking, my favorite of all time, uses soy, sugar, and vinegar, because all of these allow you to put more of the other in. More salt allows you to put more sugar in. More sugar makes the body eat more because there's a big dopamine rush. The vinegar does the same thing. So again, you can override appetite with really tasty, palatable foods. Variety as well is another thing that allows us to override the appetite. The fat jabs are essentially artificially raising the hormones that suppress appetite. So you're not necessarily getting the nutrients in to stop you eating. The hormone levels have risen, but it's because someone's just artificially turned up the dial on it. So in essence, that would be my first concern. What is the long-term risk if it's not nutrients regulating your appetite, but an external medicine which doesn't give you those nutrients? Are you getting those nutrients in when you are eating? So that would be my first concern for them.
Yeah, if you're a person that's not very clued up about nutrition in general, it's very likely that you're not going to be getting the nutrients that you need. If you're just relying on something that's going to suppress your appetite and still eating some food, it seems more likely to me that if you've got into trouble in the first place with the foods that you're eating and the effects it's having on you, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to balance perfectly the nutrient needs once you're actually suppressing your appetite. It seems like it's creating a potential problem down the road.
Yeah, and that was my first thought, and my understanding of it. I've got an article here though, and in the interest of fairness and that I'm not totally anti-drugs, it's by Sarah Vine in the Daily Mail. And the headline is, "I lost 3 stone and addiction to junk food and my taste for alcohol. Plus, I no longer even need HRT." So I just read out the section on it will cure your addiction to junk food. "I've not always had a difficult relationship with food. I was not a fat child and was not remotely self-conscious about my size until, that is, I hit puberty. That coincided, as these things often do, with a few other upheavals in my life, and I began to seek comfort in food." And this is where the emotional response comes, and we talk about comfort food and emotional eating as opposed to physiological need for eating. "Where once I'd been a light, happy child, I was now a morose, pudgy teenager. I also moved from a healthy food environment, Italy, where my parents had settled in the mid-70s, and where in those days there was virtually no processed food in the shops, and fresh, delicious produce was the norm, to a very unhealthy one, Britain in the late 1980s. Where before there had been no such thing as chips in my life, now they became a staple. There were sweets, crisps, takeaways. I went from almost exclusively living off fresh fruit and veg and simple proteins, in other words, the classic Mediterranean diet, to consuming, not to put too fine a point on it, junk. And I can pretty much echo that in my life as well. Mum and dad cooked meat and veg all my life. My introduction to junk food probably started being packed lunches at school because I hated school dinners. And then mum started having to satisfy my need for variety, and crisps and tracker bars and all sorts of things came in. Then I went to university and chips and takeaways and curries and alcohol became the norm. Processed food is the enemy. This is Sarah Vine's words, by the way. The root cause of our obesity epidemic, a product of corporate greed and the industrialization of food production. And I just want to tailor that down again today, because what we're doing, I don't want to paint business as the bogeyman. We're in business. We're trying to earn a living running a business. Does that make us bad? I think it's like everything else. There's good and bad. But there are fundamental laws of business. You've got to increase your revenue. You've got to decrease your costs. How do you increase your revenue? I said it before. You get more customers, but that's expensive. Once you've got customers, sell them more. In the food business, it just so happens making your food addictive makes them buy more. Simple as that. They're fulfilling their legal obligation to their shareholders. And many of the shareholders are our pension funds. So it's a little bit more complicated, but you do need to understand that these people are aiming to make money out of us. And so any claims about their food are fraught with conflicts of interest, I would say. And if you can be aware of that, business is there to make money. Let's look at their claims and let's look at that. But that's maybe a topic for another conversation. The product of corporate greed and industrialization of food production. It's designed in laboratories, formulated to be irresistible to the human palate. This is what I'm saying. They've got the physiologists to know how to do that. It provides little by way of nutrition, vitamins, minerals, and yet is plentiful in calories. Even when I was a teenager, processed food was on its way to supplanting real food, heavily promoted for its convenience. In reality, it was of no benefit to anyone other than the food manufacturers. They discovered that if you combine enough fat with enough sugar in the right quantities, you can get entire generations of humans hooked on foods that have long shelf lives and huge profit margins. And I would add to that, it's not just the sugars and the fats, it's also the things like the emulsifiers, which change the texture, the amount of calories that you can consume quickly. So anyone who likes drinking alcohol or has a stage in their life drinking alcohol knows that if you drink a few shots really, really quickly, you get a massive high and you get drunk very, very quickly. Drinking beer or low alcohol stuff takes a lot longer and doesn't have the same effect. That feel good from drinking those shots of alcohol very quickly is a rush of dopamine to our body. And this is how drugs are addictive. With calories, with terms of sugars and fats, we get dopamine as well. And the quicker we can consume those calories and they get into the bloodstream, the quicker we will get that dopamine. And if you look at ultra-processed foods, they are high calorie, very tasty, and very soft and easy to eat. And I think of even just a lasagna that you might buy from the store compared to a steak and the requisite carbohydrates if you have steak and potatoes or something like that, how long it takes to eat the steak and potatoes in comparison to how long it would eat to take the lasagna. The mince is already pre-chewed, essentially. It's chopped up. The lasagna is soft. You can almost just spoon it down like soup. So seemingly the same food can be eaten much, much more quickly. So back to this. That's why when I returned to the UK in the late 80s to study, my weight woes started. I didn't know any of this back then. I was just seduced by all of these. Where has it gone? Oh, I've lost the page. Here we go. All of these forbidden wonders. I began to adopt what I would call a corner shop diet. I went home after that first term noticeably heavier, but within days of eating a healthy, fresh Mediterranean diet, the weight fell off. After all, I was young. It wasn't necessarily that I was eating any less. If anything, the opposite. It was what I was eating that was so different. The other problem with junk food, apart from the fact that it makes you fat and has very little benefit, is that it's addictive. And we've talked about this. Processed foods provide an instant high followed by a crushing low and leave you wanting more. And this is the nature of all addiction. You feel good transiently and then you feel low, and your brain automatically turns to the last thing that made you feel good and the easiest thing that made you feel good. Processed foods provide an instant high followed by that crushing low. It can be a difficult cycle to break, and I think this is where the value of fat jabs potentially come in that they may help you to break this cycle. I spent the next few decades as a junk food equivalent of a functioning alcoholic. There were times when I was better able to control my cravings, others when I was not. Exercise helped to an extent, but sometimes it made things worse, since I had a tendency to reward myself for a tough workout with treats. I used to say that. I exercise more so I can eat more and drink more. And I used to be a CrossFit trainer. And a lot of the younger kids, I say younger kids, they were 20-somethings. I was 40-odd when I was doing it. They would say, so I can have my glass of wine tonight. This was the rhetoric. I'm gonna do my CrossFit workout so I can go out and have a few beers, few drinks, good food. So yeah, echoing. So many of us, I've felt that story. She's echoed this. This is like something I hear quite a lot. In my early 30s, I was diagnosed with an underactive thyroid, which undoubtedly didn't help. Hypothyroidism is an autoimmune disease and can be caused by several factors, hereditary and external. My erratic and unhealthy eating probably didn't improve matters. Either way, it was another vicious cycle. The thyroid problem made me feel so utterly dog-tired, so lethargic and exhausted, so foggy in the head, that I would find myself desperate for that sugar hit, and round it went. And this is the self-fulfilling cycle. Something doesn't work in the body because of the shit food we've been feeding. It makes you feel shit. You eat more of the shit food, you feel more shit again, and it carries on. There we go. All of which was why I found myself, aged 51, sitting in the office of Professor Marcus Reddy, a consultant general, laparoscopic and bariatric surgeon, determined to have a gastric sleeve fitted. Don't even get me started on those. I just wanted to knock the lifelong battle with my weight on the head and was prepared to have surgery to do so. I think this is something we've got to recognize. The levels of desperation that people get to and the things that they are willing to do to overcome a problem that they've maybe been battling with for years. People, will look at you and me and think our diets are fairly extreme. And okay, in the grand norm of things, you may say that again, that extreme is something I like to examine in another conversation. But a lot of us turn to seemingly desperate measures. She was going to have a gastric band, and there's all sorts of possible problems with that. In the event it was not to be, an exciting new drug had just been licensed in the UK. Mr. Reddy explained, which was able to chemically mimic the effects of a gastric band, i.e., make you want to eat less. It worked, he told me, by suppressing hunger hormones in the stomach. enabling patients to feel fuller more quickly and to no longer eat between meals. If I didn't like it, he added, I could always reconsider the surgery. I actually think that's quite a, what's the word? Like a good doctor. You know, he's a bariatric surgeon, but he's actually recommending something to avoid surgery, which I think surgery should always be considered as a last resort. I began with the daily injection and then switched to the weekly one in the form of Ozempic. Once it became available about a year later, I've never looked back. At the moment, I take 1.75 milligrams every 2 to 3 weeks. Which seems to work very well as a maintenance dose. It has been utterly life-changing. She doesn't actually talk about the food, but it was about she no longer craved the junk food.
That was interesting. She said that at the beginning, didn't she?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
she no longer craved the junk food or the alcohol.
Mm.
And I think this is key, is understanding what drives our desire for food. Now, some of it is, I think, as we talked about in our podcast, a physiological need for nutrients. But there is also this idea of appetite or food desire. I think it's talked about in some articles as food noise. We look at something and it makes us hungry. You know, McDonald's have worked this out with their advertising. They just know that little whistle, the big yellow M on the red thing, and it starts firing off our subconscious to start thinking about whatever our favourite thing from McDonald's is. And they tap into that very easily. And that's food noise. That's not a need for food. We didn't need it until we heard that little ditty or we saw the logo. You know, the bakeries do it. You know, the supermarkets, they bake fresh bread on the premises because the smell of that bread, oh, that makes me hungry. I like that. So, yeah, I do think Ozempic has a place. I'm not sure as a long-term thing that it's the way forward, but it may be for some people. But I do think we need help, education on the emotional aspects of eating, the addictive aspects, the nutritional aspects, understanding the physiology, and that actually probably, well, definitely you and I know this, that we can do this through food as well.
Yeah, let's get into that a little. So, if we're talking about appetite regulation, we did a previous podcast, as Mike's mentioned, where we went into the physiology of it and the hormones that are at play there. I don't think we need to repeat that. We can just direct people to that podcast. But from a high level view, in terms of the types of foods, you mentioned protein as being one of the main foods that gives us a feeling of satiety. There are other various micronutrients as well, which seem to be quite important. I'm pretty sure that sodium is one of them, which is interesting, given that we're often told that we should eat moderate amounts of protein or even have meat-free Mondays and things like this, and need to be very cautious of our sodium intake. There's a range of nutrients which we discussed in that podcast as well, where hitting those particular amounts seems to be what turn off the hunger signals. So you mentioned, Mike, that you've been doing something which is working for you, and I'm assuming that you're not just starving yourself and relying entirely on willpower to get through the day.
No,
do you want to talk
not
about what's working for you?
Yeah, and there are 2 times in my life where I've lost weight for fun and been able to keep it off. And at first glance, they seem diametrically opposed, but they're not actually. What I'm currently doing is carnivore, or I would say primarily animal-based. So I eat meat, eggs, cheese, some dairy, yogurt. I try to dial back on the yogurt. So primarily meat, cheese, and eggs. So quite high protein, high fat. And I've done this in various ways, not eating anything till the afternoon and eating a lot then, but also trying to get more of that in early on in the day. So maybe having a few eggs, some bacon, maybe a steak in the morning, and then topping up as I need to later on in the day. I think in an ideal world, that's what works best for me. If I go for too long without food and then I end up playing squash and stuff, I often don't think I eat enough, even though I feel full, and I end up maybe craving some chocolate and stuff at night. I've found I've gone back to eating earlier in the day, and I'm not craving the chocolate at night now. So that for me was a key indicator. I wasn't getting enough nutrients early on in the day. So I think timing can play an issue here as well. And I eat as much as I want, in fact, sometimes I try to overeat, and it's really difficult.
Why'd you try to overeat?
Just because I think when I first started researching carnivore and stuff, people said it is difficult to get enough calories initially, or you seem low, and so I deliberately went to that point of feeling stuffed. But you feel stuffed. You don't want anything more. So now I eat until the food no longer feels as enjoyable as it first did. In the same way, I guess, in the way we talk about exercising, exercise whilst it feels good, not to fatigue stuff, and eat whilst it's still being good. But when I stick to these foods, it's great. I've maintained 11 stone now, 70 kilos for since April 23. So nearly 2 years now. I have dabbled with coming off every now and then, not totally, but just introducing, say, last Christmas, introducing more chocolate. There was a lot of nostalgia in going shopping, especially where I shop, Lidl's and Aldi, because I'm German, and they had all the German chocolates and stuff like that. And very quickly I would start putting on weight. But as soon as I got back onto a week of doing carnivore, boom, and then those cravings go. And so it seems, we talked about extreme earlier. She was, Sarah Vine was going to have a gastric band, severe operation that actually severely inhibits your ability to get enough nutrition in. I restrict my food choices. It only seems restrictive because in the last 100 years, we have so much more food choice. But if you go back through our history, we had far less food choice.
If you're living in the UK, it's February at the moment. A few hundred years ago, what foods would have been available to you? Bear in mind, a lot of the things that we consider to be normal, potatoes, well, they're from Central America. They were introduced in the 1600s, I think. Tomatoes, things like that, they were introduced from the Mediterranean, I believe, by the Romans. So at this time of year in the UK, the amount of plants that would actually be available to you is pretty much zero. There might be one or two. So we would have been pre-agriculture, if we're talking about relying on grains like wheat and such like. Before that, literally all we would have had to eat would have been animal foods, perhaps if we'd figured out how to store something. I don't think there's very good evidence that people were storing plant foods over the winter in Paleolithic times. They were eating fish, seafood, and animal foods, land animals. That's all that would have been available, and we got through it.
Yeah, and I think, again, maybe for another day, an in-depth look at the digestive system and looking at the changes that have happened from when we were maybe apes, chimpanzees, etc., and the changes from then and what that entails for our nutrient intake. I've seen some interesting interpretations of our physiology, and I think it all clicked into place when it was like a comparison to our ancestral past, and that made much more sense. And yes, we had an ice age, and whilst the whole place wasn't necessarily covered in ice, You look at the Inuit, the Eskimos, the North American Indians. They had herds of thousands of bison and the like to be able to try and eat and hunt, and one bison could feed one or two people for a year in terms of what you could do. So you can imagine, spread that out between a bigger group of people, and you don't need to kill that many bison. If you've got a tribe of 50 people, for instance, the modern challenge is different. We have close to 8 billion people on the planet. And again, what we feed them is not necessarily all the sustainability. This is another interesting argument for another conversation. But sustainability, the current sustainability arguments are based on feeding cattle grains. Well, ancient cattle never ate grains. And all the water requirements and everything else around that are based around feeding them a crop, which these animals were never designed to eat in the first place. So I would like, on a different podcast to investigate that more, because that's, after health, the sustainability and the ethics of it come on board, and that's something I have been looking into a bit more.
Well, let's not turn this into a totally pro carnivore argument, because you did mention at another point you have lost weight easily doing something
Yes.
which seems on the face of it to be almost the opposite. So
That's right.
tell us about that.
So 15 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. It was a cancer that, from my understanding, was likely to come back, but I was only allowed one shot of the chemotherapy, as in one, like, there was 8 months worth of chemotherapy, but they had to try and kill the cancer straight off with those 6 cycles. It's unclear from the scans. Well, the scans showed that didn't happen. I was told I needed radiotherapy. I decided to turn that down because of the side effects of that and the likelihood of success or not. And so I started looking into complementary stuff, and I came across something called the Budwig protocol, which was essentially a high-fat, high-protein vegetarian diet. She did allow a meat if it was wild meat, which was interesting. That was buried away in some of her books. But essentially, she wanted you to be vegetarian. But the basis of it was cottage cheese, which is really interesting to me. I'll explain why in a moment. Cottage cheese, flax oil, and coconut oil. So the flax oil she felt was important for various chemical reasons. The coconut oil was really important because it didn't oxidize and it protected the flax oil. And so she made this mix of flax oil in coconut oil, which then got used as a spread or butter on vegetables and stuff like that, and for cooking in. And then the cottage cheese and flax oil mix, and the cottage cheese also seemed to protect the oxidation of the flax oil. Why is the cottage cheese interesting? There's a key amino acid in cottage cheese which fires off these appetite suppressant hormones very quickly. And I found on Budwig, again, I found it difficult to eat everything she was recommending that I should eat. And so this was, if I had this big bowl of cottage cheese, maybe with some ground linseed and stuff, fibre is another thing that seems to give us some sort of appetite suppressant, which over and above our typical processed food, it seems a useful thing. Carnivores would argue against it, but certainly moving from processed food, whole foods and vegetables and meats, I think is a way forward. But yeah, I was vegetarian and had the same weight loss. There were other things that didn't work as well. I lost a lot of muscle. On carnivore, I don't feel I have. I lost a lot of hair. My hair thinned a lot. On carnivore, that hasn't happened to the same extent. So I would say there are differences between the two, but I was definitely way better on what I was doing than I was on the food I was eating before. Way better.
Yeah. So there's a couple of parallels there. So they're both probably moderate to high protein.
Yeah.
They're both slightly very high fat.
Yes.
And low in carbs.
Yeah.
So from the macronutrient point of view, there's some similarities there. I
Yeah.
imagine the micronutrient breakdowns are very different. But from an appetite regulation point of view, it seems like that moderate to high protein and high fat
Yeah.
was
Was
the
very
key.
similar.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And
And
it
when you
was
look
easy
at,
to lose weight.
yes,
And yeah,
well,
on both of
I
those.
wasn't even trying. I was
Mm.
eating to fight cancer. I wasn't trying to lose weight. And I went from close on 14 and a half stone to 11 stone in a year and a half. You know, on carnivore, I went from 12 to 12 in 3 weeks, and then to 11 stone in another 5 months. And it was just all pretty straightforward. On carnivore, I think you'll be aware, on the Uncom group we were on, we did a particular fat cut process for a month. But I don't do that anymore, and I've maintained the same weight where I am, in pretty much the same body composition from a mirror look. I haven't gone and got a proper fat scan or anything, but my waist measurement is down at the lowest it's been for, I don't know, 20, 30 years now. So, and that's a key indicator, your waist measurement.
Mm.
So yeah, whole foods, high protein, moderate to high protein, high fat, low carb would be for me, and staying away from sweet tastes. I think that was interesting. When I moved to dark chocolate, it took me a couple of weeks, but having cut out every other source of sugar, actually within 2 weeks, I was actually quite enjoying it. And when I did try something sweet again, like I remember a particular Danone yogurt, which I thought wasn't that sweet. It was disgustingly sweet when I tried it, and I was like, ugh, don't even like that now.
Mm.
And that's what I feel on carnivore is typically anything with sweeteners or whatever. I mean, Copperberg cider, I tried a friend's drink of that. I was like, wow, I almost had to spit it out. It was so sweet. So that's one thing I found. I don't crave beer any longer, even after a hard game of squash. And I think this comes down to the impact of the gut bacteria.
Yeah, I think this sweet taste is something really, really important to just talk about for a minute. This isn't just us virtue signaling, saying, oh, I've got the willpower to not want to eat sweet things at all. Once you've had sufficient, I think, nutrition, the key things that you need, and your body's got used to that, and you've removed the sweet things from your diet, your taste for sweetness adjusts massively.
Yeah,
So what previously was pleasantly sweet becomes just way too sweet, and you'll probably still enjoy some level of sweetness, but it's recalibrated to, I would say, probably a more natural level. So
yeah,
something like a piece of fruit can taste really sweet to you if you haven't had it for a long time.
yeah,
But then let's say you have a Snickers bar, that's probably going to taste not as enjoyable as it used to.
yeah,
Maybe that's a bit of a loss. But
yeah.
if you're
Well,
trying to control, these urges to eat sweet things,
yeah,
it doesn't have to be that difficult. It doesn't have to be that difficult.
yeah. I think on that point, this was quite an interesting one because my first Christmas was interesting on this. This was an article. If you can read that, whether that's coming up properly, but
Mm-hmm.
essentially, no mince pies, no Baileys, no fun. Yes, I love being thinner, but there's a price to pay. And the short of the long of this story was that she got the outcome that she desired, but she no longer enjoyed the things she used to enjoy. And at Christmas, that was the drink, the alcohol, the socializing. And we've had this with a couple of clients that we coach and stuff like that, the difficulties that come about through that. Interestingly for me, my second Christmas round, having realized I dipped into the chocolates and stuff like that, and my taste for them did come back very quickly.
Mm.
In fact, it was a good lesson for that, to realize how addictive these things were, how easy it was to get the bug back again. And I caught a whole string of colds as well afterwards. And interestingly, carbohydrate sugars compete for the same receptors as vitamin C. So it's likely that vitamin C requirements are much higher on a high carb diet than they are on a low carb diet.
You had the
as a
same experience last year, didn't you?
yeah,
You fell off the diet a little bit and had
yeah,
colds for a little while afterwards.
yeah. So
Mm.
this year I didn't. I was
Hmm.
much. I now I had the emotional thing. Like, well, I don't want to go and get all the colds again, and I don't want to have to start losing weight again, stuff like that. I don't want it to be difficult. And so, whilst I did have occasional chocolates, far less. Um, I did go through a patch recently, last few weeks of getting back into Greek yogurt and honey, and then having a decaf coffee and chocolate after that. And it went from one chocolate to two chocolates to three chocolates. Um, I've just like, I'm not sure I like the way this is going, because having that late at night will be firing off my insulin. My insulin will suppress melatonin production. Melatonin is not only about making you sleepy, it's about repairing and rejuvenating stuff in the body. It's massive for that. And that's actually another podcast, I think, because we can get daytime melatonin as well. And that's a practice that I've started during the day to increase that. But yeah, emotionally, what I'm realizing is that my results on a squash court may just the comments, oh, you're looking really good, Mike. You know, all of this sort of stuff, they're replacing the emotional need for the food. And actually, I thought I would get bored when I first started. I couldn't understand how I could do this because I'd done it once before and it was horrible. The first 3-4 days were, I just, oh, can't be doing with this anymore. But interesting, I was eating chicken most of the time then, and I wonder whether that had a role. Now it's predominantly red meat, beef and lamb for me. And every day when I'm hungry, it tastes delicious. Absolutely tastes delicious. And then I don't miss it until I'm hungry again.
When
And I
I've
don't miss
done
anything else.
when I've done strict carnivore, basically red meat and very little else. Um, the interesting thing for me was the appeal of all of the foods just began to fall away. I didn't want anything else.
Yeah,
And as you said, it tastes great when you eat it. You eat until you're satisfied, and then you're done, and
yeah.
you don't think about it again for a good few hours.
And that may be, I think that's an interesting thing about the fat jabs, in that they may seem to have a similar effect to that, which I think could be quite powerful in breaking the cycle. But I would want it to go with some form of counseling, education, etc., to understand what good food is, and then actually, can you wean yourself off the fat jabs and do it without? Um, that for me would be an ideal way forward. It would be a lot cheaper for both the individual and the NHS. If we could get people eating to their evolutionary design, but it is difficult. Um, so yeah, the whole food, high protein, high fat, maybe some green veg, some salad or whatever. I know a lot of people really like that aspect of it, and occasionally, yeah, I really like it. Tomato or a piece of cucumber or something with it, but less and less so. And salad dressings now tend to put me off. Um, so, and I do really enjoy my steak every day.
Yeah, well, I think you brought it back round to the fat jabs, and perhaps this is a good place to wrap it up. We've been going for about an hour. Were
Yeah,
there any other things that you wanted to add as we finish off?
no, really, just to summarize where we think it's like, if you're really struggling with a weight issue and you've likely got associated health issues with that, then the fat jabs are potentially a way forward to get you started. Um, but if you feel you could do it through diet, go for high protein, high fat, same thing. And if you do the fat jabs, look at educating yourself so that you can take control and you're not reliant on this being doled out by somebody, because there's no guarantee that you'll be able to get it. You know, the licensing rules have already changed within the last month, so that online pharmacies cannot dole it out to anyone now who says they need it, which was the case. If you've got lots of money, you'll probably be able to get around that. Private doctors have their ways of getting stuff, but for the general public, I think it's about learning to take control of your own health and understanding how your body works. Understand where the information comes from. If it's coming from a corporation, they've got their shareholders to think about as well as you, is all I would say.
Okay, nice summary. Nice summary there, Mike. Thanks.
Cool.